On a quiet street in Daly City, California, a US Navy blimp lay crumpled between the houses. Police and firefighters forced their way into the gondola expecting to find two pilots, but it was empty. Lieutenant Ernest Cody and Ensign Charles Adams had taken off that morning on a routine patrol over the Pacific. Now that aircraft blocked Bellevue Avenue, and both men were gone. They were never found. Hi, I'm Harriet, and welcome back to the channel. Most military disappearances happen when no one's watching, over enemy territory or out on the ocean at night. This one happened close to shore in daylight, in front of boat crews who watched almost the whole thing unfold. It's still not fully explained. That's what makes it so chilling. The Navy would eventually call it the Ghost Blimp. To understand how it earned that name, we need to go back to Treasure Island a few hours before it came down over Daly City. That Sunday morning, the L-8 sat waiting at a small advance base on Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. It had already led quite a life. 4 months earlier, it had flown vital aircraft parts out to the USS Hornet, shortly before the carrier launched the Doolittle raid on Japan. Not bad for something that began its life as a Goodyear advertising blimp. But by 1942, the cheerful civilian paint job was gone, the gondola had been refitted for war, and the L-8 belonged to the Navy. Lieutenant Ernest Cody was 27, an Annapolis graduate and an experienced airship pilot. His commanding officer called him one of the most capable pilots and able officers under his command, and the men who knew him remembered someone calm under pressure, not the type to lose his head. Beside him was Ensign Charles Adams, 34, who had spent more than 2 decades around airships. And extraordinarily, Adams had already survived the era's worst airship disasters. He'd been aboard the USS Macon when she crashed into the Pacific in 1935 and lived. And when the Hindenburg caught fire at Lakehurst in 1937, Adams was there too. Was decorated by the German government for helping rescue passengers from the flames. Somehow he'd come through it all. Now, only a day after receiving his commission, he was making his first flight as an officer. Witnesses remembered the two of them in good spirits as they climbed aboard. The patrol ahead looked routine. West through the Golden Gate, a sweep around the Farallon Islands and Point Reyes, then south along the coast past Montara Beach before heading back to Treasure Island, nothing they hadn't done before. Just after 6, the L-8 lifted off and headed out over the open Pacific. Fishing boats dotted the water below. San Francisco faded into the mist behind them. For an hour and a half, nothing happened. Then Cody looked down and saw something on the water. A dark patch of oil spreading roughly 25 miles off the coast. Now, in August 1942, you obviously didn't just fly past something like that. Japanese submarines had already been operating off this coast, and an oil slick could mean a damaged enemy vessel hiding just beneath the surface. So Cody brought the blimp down low and radioed it in. His message was brief. "Am investigating suspicious oil slick. Stand by." The base waited for the follow-up, and it never came. The morning was calm but overcast, a low grey ceiling pressing down over the Pacific. Visibility stretched for miles across flat water. The L-8 dropped low over the slick, circling so close that the boats nearby could watch every move it made. One of the boats was the Albert Gallatin. Its crew saw smoke markers fall from the blimp and ran for the ship's guns, bracing for the submarine to surface. Nearby, the trawler Daisy Gray began hauling in its nets. If the L-8 had found something down there, depth charges might be next. Both crews could see 2 men aboard the blimp. It still looked completely under control. So Cody and Adams were still up there. Whatever happened to them hadn't happened yet. For over an hour, the L-8 worked the slick, dropping low, climbing again, sinking back down again. Nobody watching from the water saw either man leave the gondola, but the depth charges never fell. Just after 9, the L-8 started to climb. Then it turned east, back towards San Francisco. At the base, Cody's promised update hadn't come through. At first, that wasn't so unusual. Radio contact with blimps could be unreliable, there'd been no emergency call, and the L-8 had fuel to spare. But the minutes stretched on, and the search planes went up to find it. Later that morning, a Pan American pilot spotted the L-8 near the Golden Gate, apparently heading home. Then another pilot watched it climb far above its normal patrol altitude before it vanished back into the cloud. And here's where things start to get mysterious. When the L-8 dropped back under those clouds, it didn't look like the aircraft that had left Treasure Island that morning. The outer shell of the craft was losing pressure, folding in on itself as it sagged towards Ocean Beach. It touched down on the sand just for a moment. People ran towards it and grabbed for the lines, but before anyone could hold it down, it lifted off again and drifted inland. It crossed streets and rooftops, tearing down power lines as it went, until it finally came to rest across Bellevue Avenue in Daly City. Firefighters and police reached it within minutes and climbed into the control car. The door was hooked open. The parachutes were still stowed. Cody and Adams were gone. Once the blimp was secured, Navy investigators went through it piece by piece. At first glance, it looked like the two men had simply stepped out. 3 parachutes were still on board, along with the rubber life raft, packed and unused. The transmitter had been left switched on, though its battery was dead. The engine switches had been left on too, though the engines themselves had stopped, and the crew's own belongings were still sitting inside. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no damage suggesting the L-8 had been fired on or hit on the water. Investigators even found undisturbed dust under the gondola floor, clear evidence it had never touched the sea. The Navy searched the water and coastline extensively between the Farallon Islands and San Francisco. Both men should have been wearing life jackets, so searchers looked for anything that might have washed ashore, but nothing ever did. When investigators pieced together the witness accounts, the picture held steady. 2 men had been visible in the gondola near the oil slick, and nobody saw either of them fall. Investigators checked the weather, the engines, the fuel, the radio. There was no violent storms or a mechanical failure, no sign of enemy action. They also, of course, investigated Cody and Adams, and they found nothing pointing to desertion or a plan to disappear. The aircraft gave up almost nothing. It was patched up and sent back into service. So investigators couldn't prove how Cody and Adams had left the L-8. Lieutenant Commander Watson, who commanded the squadron and knew L-type airships very well, offered the theory that the Navy eventually settled on. While the blimp flew low, one man may have slipped near an open hatch and ended up hanging from the gondola. The other had gone to pull him back in, and both had gone into the sea. If it all happened within a matter of seconds, the theory explains why the engine switches and the radio were left on, and why the survival gear never moved. It could even explain the L-8's sudden climb, because losing the weight of 2 full-grown men would make the blimp much lighter. But it's still just a theory. Nobody saw either man go over the side, and the inquiry couldn't quite say where it had happened. Aviation historian Dan Grossman later raised an obvious objection. If one man had fallen, why would the other abandon a working radio rather than just mark the position and call for help? But obviously no call had come, and neither man was ever seen again. So the Navy had a sequence that made sense, but it just couldn't prove any of it. Once the official inquiry had closed without a firm answer, other explanations started to gather around the case. Newspapers and later writers floated capture by a Japanese submarine, a hidden attacker, desertion, or a fight in the gondola. One witness even claimed she'd seen 3 men aboard the gondola through binoculars. Others said they'd seen parachutes in the sky, but none of it survives contact with the gondola itself. Parachutes were found untouched in the control car. There's no evidence of a third person and no blood or damage pointing to any kind of struggle. The submarine theory made emotional sense at the time. America had been at war for less than a year. Japanese submarines really were operating off the coast, and the L-8 had just stopped over a suspicious oil slick. It's not hard to see why people reach for that explanation. But think about what it would actually require. A submarine surfacing close to several American vessels, pulling two armed officers off a blimp, and letting the aircraft drift away, all without anyone seeing or hearing a thing. No Japanese record has ever confirmed anything like it. There is one last story worth telling, though. Years after the war, a letter reached the Navy. Cody's widow wrote to say that her mother believed she'd seen him alive in Phoenix, Arizona, years after he'd vanished. She said his eyes looked wrong, as though he was in shock or not quite himself. There's, of course, no evidence any of that was true. It was a third-hand sighting, but it's an eerie story nonetheless. There's one detail that makes this case hard to forget. The Navy repaired the control car, fitted it under a new envelope, and sent it back into service. After the war, it went back to Goodyear, and today the original control car sits in the National Navy Aviation Museum. Maybe the Navy had it right. One man fell and the other one went after him, and both were lost before either could call for help. But nobody saw anything happen, and no body was ever recovered. The machine survived the war, and the mystery survived with it. So what do you think? If you've got a theory, I'd love to read it in the comments below. And if a case like this is the kind of thing you enjoy digging into, that's exactly what this channel is for. So consider subscribing or becoming a member. I'll see you next time.